Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for episode 13 of season 4 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin, and I'm the founder, producer, and host for this series. It's National Poetry Month. Launched in April of 1996 by the Academy of American Poets, National Poetry Month celebrates poets' integral role of this literary genre and its way of representing and influencing culture and society. Over time, it has become one of the largest literary celebrations in the world, with tens of millions of readers, students, educators, librarians, booksellers, literary event curators like myself, publishers, families, and writers marking the occasion with virtual and in-person events around the globe. As poetry was my entry point to creative writing, I love that Black Writers Read can contribute to the global dialogue this month about why this mode of storytelling continues to matter. I want to thank every single poet who has joined me on this virtual stage over the years and who will join me this month in honor of National Poetry Month. So let's go ahead and get today's conversation started. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind-the-scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted over 60 authors representing 10 plus genres from 4 countries and 15 states. Our virtual platform includes the live stream interviews, which you're watching today, the audio podcasts, book clubs, and curriculum development assistance. Find us online at blackwritersread.com and be sure to subscribe to Black Writers Read wherever you get your audio podcasts. Today, we welcome Nandi Comer from my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. We've known each other a long time. We go back to Interlochen Arts Camp, University of Michigan. It's so great to be in a virtual space with her again after so long. So it's so great to have her here. Nandi Comer is the Poet Laureate of Michigan. She is the author of American Family, a syndrome published by Finishing Line Press in 2018 and Tapping Out, published it by Triquarterly in 2020, which was awarded the 2020 Society of Midland Authors Award and the 2020 Julie Suk Award. She is a Cave Canem Fellow, a Callaloo Fellow, and a 2019 Kresge Arts in Detroit Fellow, which is a huge deal back in the Midwest. She is the co-director of Detroit Lit, a project that provides reading and professional development opportunities for narrative makers of color in Detroit. To learn more about Nandi and her other work, please visit her website at nandicomer.com, which is NANDICOMER.com. Throughout our conversation and also during her reading, I will be sharing her website and also our Instagram page. For those of you who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format of our show. Nandi will share some of her poems and then we'll chat about her work. If time remains at the end of the conversation, we'll open it up to Q&A for those who are joining us today. We have viewers joining us from Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform where you're joining us from today. I will compile the questions and either pose them to our guests following the conversation or insert them during an appropriate time within our chat. I am getting chills because fellow Detroiter, I now like to bring Nandi onto the virtual stage.
Hey, well,
Hey.
what up though?
Yes! Yes! Yes, to hear that from somebody in the D right now is so, I needed that. Thank you. Thank you. I was about to say it, but you did it for me.
Come on now, let's go.
Yes! Which I don't know if you saw it on social media or not, but I recently, a couple months ago, got the downtown Detroit skyline tattoo on my right arm.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's
Yeah,
beautiful. That's what's up. Well, come on now, Detroit daughter. We always welcome you home. We will always welcome you home.
Thank you. It's so great to see you.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. So I'll turn it over to you to read, and then I'll be back shortly.
Sure, I'm gonna read a couple of poems. I'm really, really grateful to be here. I'm really happy to share some work. I'm gonna read a poem from American Family, then I'll read a poem from Tapping Out, and then I have two new poems, two newish poems that I'd love to share with you all. So, American Family is a chapbook that came out like back in 2018, so now it's a little bit older than other things that I've written. I wrote it well in a time of grief, but also in response to a lot of the video recordings that were being released online of a lot of moments of just racialized violence happening, and this predates, the kind of things that we saw during COVID and the lockdown. It's actually I started writing these poems shortly after Trayvon Martin's murder, and I started thinking about how we as a society, as Americans, have developed ways of survival that feel almost like we've been changed mentally. So I started coming up with these poems called The Syndromes. So I thought I'd share a syndrome with you. This is an invented syndrome, but definitely representative of some things I see in my community. Just so you all know, it is in two parts. Oh, my book is old. Got to get a new copy of my book. But it is in two parts where there is a scientist voice and a lyric voice. So the first part, American Family, a syndrome, early death syndrome. Terminal illness. Upon learning the short life expectancy of men and women from his or her community, a patient suffering from early death syndrome embraces the inevitability of an early death. Usual signs of EDS exhibit in Black males and females ranging from ages 10 to 35. Early symptoms include testing the limitations of pain by engaging in suicidal activities such as dislocating joints out of sockets, jumping from rooftops, and or participating in backyard mixed martial arts competitions. Generally, these activities are followed by an unhealthy consumption of processed food and insomnia. In many cases, a patient imagines his limbs disappearing or reappearing. Most patients have been known to whisper to friends and family that they are already gone. Almost all have experienced dreams depicting their own deaths and or funerals. Patients express debilitating survival behavior such as a distrust of all strangers and feelings of constant endangerment. At the same time, the knowledge of an early demise causes fearless behavior. Some have been known to stand in close proximity of high speed traffic, while others resort to consuming poisonous substances. In most common cases, patients involved violently provoke others suffering from the same illness. In rare occurrences, patients with debilitating behavior similar to the avoidant personality disorder, otherwise known as the hermit complex. Unfortunately, neither denying nor provoking an early death has proven to be resourceful in the treatment of this fatal disease. Almost all patients find their demise under the same following circumstances: violence inflicted by a member of private security, mistaken identity by law enforcement, self inflicted wounds, or lethal assault by private citizens. Inevitably, in its final stages of taking over the body, all patients suffering from this illness utter the following statements moments before passing: I can't breathe. Why are you treating me like this? I didn't do anything wrong. What did I do? Please stop. You're hurting me. Early death syndrome 2. Remember that time the cops found cousin Rosa on the east side carjacking some woman? Said she stepped right in front of a silver Caprice, pulled that frightened lady out of her car like a rag. Remember how her daughter had to go down to the precinct, had to explain that her mother got them voices. Remember her brother, that slim shell of a boy, how he put 3 bullets in their mother and then left himself shot and dead in the drive? Coward, said Uncle Otha. The devil, said Mama. Hyperparanoid schizophrenic, said the docs. And remember that girl he loved? When she heard, she dropped all her body rubber band legs and horse shoulders, dropped them all in the middle of the den like a sack of oranges. Remember how the whole family came to the cemetery to put mother and son in the ground, how Rosa refused to buy the coffin, said she'd rather build boxes from the planks of her picket fence, said each board carried the sound of her family's southern snarl grief, each of her dead meshed in the wood grain. And who hasn't seen death, that ruthless engineer, stack the bricks of the rickety house, one broken brain on top of another? Rosa's uncle took his wife by knife, and cousin Robert still hold a bullet in his back from when his mother tried and failed. Death can be relentless in his building, can't he? You remember Rosa in the street screaming down at that woman, something about that car, or was it something about her brother, I mean granddad, or was it about auntie or me, or this next poem that I want to share with y'all, it comes from Tapping Out. Tapping Out is mostly about Mexican wrestling, but it also is about a lot of other things. And so I just wanted to share one of my wrestling poems with you all. Know that there's some Detroit poems, there are love poems, there are travel poems in here, but there are also still a lot of poems about wrestling in here. And so I thought it'd be really good to share something from there since I'm not reading any other sports poems today. Call the Match. When he pins your shoulders to the mat, you'll use all your limbs to throw his hold. Whip your legs around his torso, scissor him down. The crowd might cheer, they might heckle, cigarette smoke will curl into the spotlights, and the small room will feel like your guaranteed win. None of this matters. You're supposed to lose. After you back bend his body, you'll take a headbutt. He will launch you from the ring into the stands. You will fall flat face. Your twisted body will feel its knotted ache. Make it look good. Let him win. Refuse to get up. Listen for the slow hiss of breath escaping your chest. It will feel like a tornado churning between your ribs. In a different fight, in a different city, in a different ring, you will make another man plead through the calls. But tonight, you'll taste salt. You'll taste the metal in your own bloody lip. When he slams your forehead to a bleacher, lie there, open mouthed, shocked even, as if this is not the plan. Fold to pain, submit to the job, fall. A boy in the second row will launch potato chips in your face. A wrinkled woman might call you coward, though they know your body, this arena, and their seat in your world are a false framework. Each fanatic specter will swarm the ring, demanding you perform the calls. The crowd will hate you. The crowd will love the choreography of the takedown. The crowd will go home satisfied. So, I've been working on a lot of poems about being a woman and growing into femininity, but also kind of the dangers of the stories that we hear as women. And so I'm going to share 2 pieces from a series of poems that I've been working on. I'm hoping that they, fall into this next collection that I'm working on, which is really about the 90s. But, if I'm going to write about the 90s growing up as a girl, we have to write about the joys and dangers of being a Black woman in America. And so this one is A Gaggle of Stone Geese. About fat hands, about his pressing down, about the many moments of him, there was always more, A herd, a tangle of hares, a gaggle of stone geese sending the signal. There goes their sweat again, his salt again. A harvest of narrow pelvises, the wake of warnings, what to do with the siege of sobs on my phone. A drove of defenses. Somewhere in Minneapolis, there is a man who loves 16-year-olds. Yes, loves. I heard the timeline. I heard of another carpet, another school, another flock. What do we call a group of gropes? His pride? His prickle? Or the tribe that let him name them? Name the gathering of hands, name their crash, their collective unkindness, the bevy, how their beauty is a conspiracy again and again and again, holding her down. And this last poem, I'm been working through a form where I'm kind of like breaking the form as well. But I typically have thought of the Abecedarian poem as kind of an elementary poem. It's where, you write the alphabet down the side of the page, and then you write a line that each line starts with a letter from the alphabet. And I've always thought of those as being kind of like, oh, wishy-washy or whatever. But I started to think about mine and in general women's relationships to bras. And so I've started to write abecedarians based on the different bra systems. And so it follows it where there's a double D in there at some point. And this one is the American bra sizing. And the series it starts with a quote from Drake. 36L, how many sizes are there? Bra abecedarian. Angular elbows and knees. I was 12 when boys at church noticed them. Then I was a small cupped girl, itty bitty titty committee queen. I wished for D cups, a Baywatch bod. Instead, I slipped into trainers while Dee Dee and Shayla and Candace arched their backs. Every girl curves into the weight of a body not ready to feel the slope and bust of a boy's wanting gaze. I touched my nipples. I watched my mother hunch over, scoop her heavy chest into stiff cones. Then it began, my slow march through each letter, double D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Each season I spilled into a bigger size. I wanted to bounce on beaches in kite-shaped string bathing suits. Instead, my size meant cheap satin, lace, and beige breeches. No pinks, no patterns, no matching thongs for girls over G. The hard, narrow straps cut at my shoulders and rib cage, or wires and padding pinched into my body. No praise for a titty too big for a halter top or strapless. Quilted stitch of nipple, dark areola, fatty tissue reduced to sex. So much of my body is a harvest of cells, or simply a spectacle. Oh, to be alone, groping their thickness, their color, their weight. I praise myself. Undoing each hook, I set loose my exquisite chest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandi, especially for reading new work that you're working on. It means a lot that you're sharing it with us today. And one of my questions, and I love that your work, the two new pieces talk a little bit about this, but I love the way in which you capture the performative nature of existence that we do every day. Like, I love that is so very clear in themes of your work.
Thank you. I'm glad you're picking up on that. Thank you.
So the first question I have for you is, and this is going to be really interesting because we've, have known each other, especially as creatives, for a long time. I like to start off today's conversation by asking, how did you discover that your voice and your stories were to be delivered through poetry?
That is a good question. And I think it still changes depending on what I'm doing. There are moments when I work through short story. I haven't published a lot of that kind of work, or essays, which I've had an opportunity to publish a couple of those. But I think I default to poetry because it asks for precision. It asks for telling sometimes large narratives in these very concise ways. And so I don't know that I chose it in a way that was like, oh, that is what I tried all these other genres and this is what works for me. I think as I was starting to write, and I mean, you met me when I was a high school student. When I started to write in high school, it became very intuitive to me to work through poetry, even though as a child I had been, journaling and doing all kinds of things. I was first introduced to poetry as a way of working through craft, and that seems to be my default. Even when I'm writing an essay in poetry, in fiction, I always am like much more lyrical, is what my peers tell me when they read my work, is that I tend to look at the lyric and think about ways of crafting images through that tend to sing or have like a lot of precision in their descriptions. So
I, want to applaud you because one thing that I don't know if Black Writers Read supporters realize this. So you published American Family and Syndrome in 2018 and Tapping Out in 2020. For poetry to publish two collections that close together is huge. Like, it is a huge deal.
Well, they weren't written together. I will say that they were not written. That's why the second full-length collection has not come out yet, because I had been working on. So I wrote Tapping Out prior to actually conceptualizing American Family as a collection. It took me about 4 to 5 years to like really get most of the poems of Tapping Out. And then as I was completing it, I was also working on my thesis, my master's and MFA thesis. And so I started to send Tapping Out. I think I spent 2 years sending it out to publishers. And I really wanted to win a contest. I was like, I really want to win a contest with my first book. And it was like a finalist for like 4 or 5 contests. And I was actually getting a little discouraged because I was like, well, something about it is not being communicated. Something about the way that the work is being presented is not, even when I submitted my thesis, one of my thesis advisors had said a comment that made me think that, oh, something about the way I'm presenting it on page is not clear. And so I started to, when Tapping Out was done, and then I had come home and started, not only had I been writing the syndromes, but I started to experience the process of losing a parent. My mother was terminally ill. And so I was processing that while also working on another performative project. And so those poems came out really rapidly, and they came out, there were some older poems, and then there's one poem that is shared between the two collections. But in general, I was like, well, if Tapping Out isn't gonna get published, maybe I should start, And Finishing Line Press had a contest. And so I just went out on a limb and put together American Family as a short chapbook. I didn't think that I could continue. I was right. I didn't think I could continue writing the way that I was writing, especially once my mother had passed away. And so I sent it to Finishing Line. It did not win. Again, I was not a winner for the Finishing Line contest, but they offered me a publication contract for the work. And I was elated. Like, I was able to work with a Detroit artist, Sydney James, in order to get the cover. And I didn't have anything yet. So while I was waiting on tapping out in like probably right after I signed the contract for Finishing Line, I was contacted by Triquarterly, by Northwestern, saying that they were interested in publishing Tapping Out. So it feels like, like American Family was written, then Tapping Out came out. It was like they were both kind of written before any publication contract came for either of them. And so it was an interesting thing to have enough work to, like, after writing one book, to go ahead and have enough work that would go into another. So yeah, that is not the case these days.
Yes, yeah, because that's an aside question, because I typically send questions to our guests beforehand. What is your writing life? Because I didn't realize these two bodies of work, like how they came together. But I'm just curious, like, what is your writing life? How often are you able to write? And how much time do you set aside to write?
So I do set aside enough time to, like, actually just engage in the activity of writing every day. And I use it's been a little strange this last year since the appointment to Poet Laureate. But when I was working full time, especially when these two books were being finished, I would use the weekends, like when I had long uninterrupted time, to do revision, or I would use submission deadlines as a time for revising poems. I usually use deadlines as a way to, like, get into, like, what is this poem going to really look like in the end. And so oftentimes I don't try to think about projects for poems until they start to speak to each other in a certain way, or that I'm struck with something that I want to work through. And so American Family wasn't a project. They were just singular poems. The syndromes were things that I had decided I felt I wanted to speak to, but even the syndromes, conceptually, I had been writing the syndromes, I'd been writing the doctor's voice for a year before I just sort of happened upon a lyric poem, and I put those two together and I said, oh, this is how I want to conceive of, so it might take a while for a poem to shape itself conceptually. And then the actual work of, like, developing a collection, I think, is a very different thing. I knew when I would set out to write Tapping Out, I knew I was writing a series of poems about wrestling, but I also knew that I wanted to tackle things like travel. I know I wanted to tackle things like language, and I wanted to think about, because I didn't want it to be just about wrestling. I think that the Tapping Out had a very different like approach, and it's probably similar to what's happening with the collection that I'm working on now. So yeah.
Yeah. So on American Family, a Syndrome, poet Patricia Smith writes, utilizing a conjured language that both unsettles and incites, as well as an impressive array of innovative forms, Nandi Comer ciphers power from the bullseye trained on the black body. These poems are impossible to turn away from. This is the drawn in breath, the necessary work. Can you talk about a little bit more about the curation process of particularly American Family, especially since um, it wasn't originally necessarily thought of as a collection? I love how your response to the previous question flows nicely here. How did you essentially select the poems that would become a part of this particular collection, especially since I believe this is your debut book,
Right.
American Family?
I think, like I said, I knew that I had this series of poems. I mean, I had written a lot of syndromes that aren't in the book. I think there's only 3 in the book, but I had written a lot of them, probably upwards of about 10 or 15. Not all of them worked, and so that's why there are only 3. Once I understood that, so there were some tragic things that had happened in my family, and some of them I noticed that like they were the result of someone suffering from mental illness acting on other people in the family and then causing great trauma to then create a mental instability in those people in the family, and then repeating that cycle of them then enacting on other people in the family. So the trauma beget trauma beget trauma. And I started to think about like how that was very similar to the trauma of racism and the trauma of a racialized act and America's first sin of like participating in the slave trade and then furthering this system of inequality for people of color. And so I don't want to let racist acts off the hook and saying like they're just a mere mental illness, because I don't think that. But I do think that it goes deeper in the subconscious that can be akin to having a misconception about what is happening in your life. So like it just once that clicked for me, and then the concept of like it being a part of an American identity, it being the way in which we all are in an American family, that not just like my family is an American family, but how we relate to one another is a American thing. And that as family, we treat each other very poorly at times. And so once that happened, I started to go through my catalog of poems and went, oh, On Coming Home to Teach belongs in here. And there were other poems I was like, this belongs in there. I was like, no, I don't think it belongs in here. And I pulled it out. Or like once they accepted the book, I asked if I could add 3 more poems to the collection. And the finishing line wanted to review it because they had accepted the manuscript as it was. And they said, oh, no, this is great. Go ahead and we can add these poems to the collection. And so it didn't really, it wasn't as if I was like, I am going to write a book about this, and this. It was more like I had these poems, and as I was conceptualizing these poems, I thought, oh, those are connected to these other poems that I've been writing. And that I felt was a much more, it made me think of myself as an artist and what I am consumed with and my own obsessions more. Whereas like tapping out, I was like, I have an obsession. I am going to write towards this obsession I already have, versus being like, oh, this is in this poem, and did you know that you've just been thinking about these things? and let's put them all together because they speak to one another. So that those are just very different approaches, and I don't value either approach over the other. So
yeah, segues so nicely into the next question. Tapping Out explores the performative nature of how we exist and navigate our worlds through the motif of Mexican freestyle wrestling, which I absolutely love. Readers follow you through experiences of adapting the body and protecting the body through a myriad of spaces. Like one of my favorite pieces was the rolling of the tongue with Miss Alvarez.
oh,
I love that piece.
yeah.
Can you talk about this? Yeah, talk about the poetry collection, the origin of its title, and the works within this collection.
Yeah. So some things are just kind of like cop outs where I was like, I never actually wrote a poem tapping out, which is really interesting because a lot of people, they're always like, where's the title poem? I didn't do that for some reason. When I kept thinking about the title of what I wanted to do, tapping out, the idea of rendering yourself to the actual, competition and letting go and giving up, giving yourself up to something, that I just was like, oh, I kind of like that title. And it's a cop out. I don't like try to, but it works. People seem to like it. And so it worked. And anytime I tried any other titles, I was like, no, I think I like this. And so the titling was a little different than like American Family was much more conceptual. Like, oh no, I think it needs to do this thing. with tapping out, it started, if I'm really honest, the poems took 10 years. But the first 3 years were poems that were bad poems that were just me trying to write towards an experience that I was having abroad. I started traveling abroad, and I found myself in a lot of places where there weren't many people of African descent. And so I was writing poems about like being something that was always being seen, something that where I would go out to see, the spectacle of a country and then become a spectacle because people were staring at me, wanting to touch me and take pictures of me. And this would happen in Nepal, it happened in Mexico, it happened in Spain, it happened in Germany. And so I was always trying to figure out how, we could write towards this thing that I know that African Americans who travel abroad feel it. And what does it mean to also have that complicated by the fact that we come from historically underprivileged viewpoint, and then to be walking around with the privilege of these American passports in spaces of economy and where we actually have a lot of power. Well, those poems are really bad. They weren't working. I would share them with people. They were like, "We don't know what you're doing. We don't understand." And I was at a retreat. When I was writing as a fellow with Cave Canem, a Mexican American poet, Brenda Cardenas, was there as a guest writer, and she was wearing a rosary bracelet. But instead of the saints, it was like an All Saints bracelet. But instead of the saints, it had Mexican wrestlers on the bracelet. And she asked, and I was like, oh my God, that's like Mil Máscaras and Rey de Jalisco and Hijo del Santo. And she was like, why do you know what these are? Why do you, Black girl from Detroit, know what these are? And I was like, oh, well, I had studied, I taught in Mexico for a couple of years. And while I was there, I became a big fan of the sport. And she said, oh, you should write about that sometimes. And I immediately was like, no, that feels like an appropriation. That feels like something that is not mine. I'd already become aware of what it meant to be an American in a post-colonial world where American imperialism is a very oppressive thing in a lot of countries, particularly in Mexico. So what does it mean for me as an American to be writing about somebody else's culture? And she said, well, because you think that way, you're already knowing that you have to avoid being that. So it meant that when I'm writing about the wrestling, I don't get to just write about the rules and how lovely it is. Detroit shows up in it. How we process violence shows up in it. Denzel Washington shows up in it. And, Skip Gates, and I have an imaginary conversation between, the wonderful historian Skip Gates and the Mexican philosopher Vasconcelos, and having them discuss the intricacies around racial identity and what it means to be of something, not of something, named by something and named by somebody else. And that to me made a much more sophisticated collection than if I were to be like, look at how they wrestle in the ring. Isn't that cute and funny? It wouldn't have been the kind of book that I wanted to write. So.
Yeah. And this just highlights, I think, the reason why you're Poet Laureate of Michigan now, but more importantly, you are the first Poet Laureate in over 60 years, which is one, Poet Laureate of Michigan being you and from Detroit is huge, but it's even bigger that the program came back after so long and you're Poet Laureate now. So can you talk about the duties assumed? One, I want to hear about, when you heard the news. And then can you talk about the duties assumed by this role? What does it mean to be a Detroiter specifically serving the capacity as Poet Laureate of Michigan? And then can you share some of your goals and aspirations while serving in this capacity?
Yeah, sure. I may have to ask you to repeat some parts, but let's start with how I found it. There was a fellow poet and writer who contacted me, and she said, well, sometimes I do those readings for the Library of Michigan. Well, they're looking for someone. Can you just send me a packet? Send me a list of all the things that you've done, all the projects you've been working on recently. And, I didn't think much. I was like, sure, I would love to do stuff in Michigan. Great. I had, Tapping Out had recently come out. So I was like, it's really hard to have a book come out during COVID. And so I was really trying to get the book out there in any way that I could. And so she called me back 2 weeks later, and she's like, remember when I asked you for that packet? I was like, yeah. She's like, well, I nominated you to be Poet Laureate of Michigan. And my jaw dropped. I was like, oh. And she's like, and you're a finalist. And and she said, so we need you to fill out all this paperwork, and somebody from the library will contact you soon. And I thought, oh, well, I'm honored. But Michigan is a poetry state. Michigan, we churn out poets. We got poets, even if they don't live in Michigan. We have poets that live in other places from Michigan who got their start in Michigan. So I just was like, oh, it's great. I mean, it was great being nominated. I was just like, I'm glad that somebody's paying attention to me. And then a couple of months after filling out the paperwork, I was notified by the Library of Michigan that I was selected, and I was elated. I still to this day don't believe it. But once I finally spoke with the Library of Michigan, which is a department under the Department of Education, it became much more clear why I was selected, because now I can get into the responsibilities. As a part of the responsibilities that I have, I am touring the whole state, both the upper and lower peninsula. And there are 8 stops each year that are at libraries and schools, and writer residencies, and taught poetry of all ages. And so some of the things that I do is that I go into schools. I just taught in a town called Leland, Michigan, which is about a half an hour north of Traverse City. And I was in an auditorium with 70 high school students, and we were all talking poetry. And while that might be intimidating to some writers, that was really a lot of fun. I got kids, no one raised their hand when I asked if any of them had ever written poetry. And then by the end, I had 15 students wanting to share their poem that they had written with us. And so that is part of the responsibilities. Other responsibilities include, I hosted the Poetry Out Loud contest last month, the recitation contest. So there is an expectation that the Poet Laureate participates either as a judge or a host. And then the other major responsibility is that I'm fulfilling a project this year. And so this year we have enough funding for a couple of billboards, but we're still looking for a little bit more funding. But I am going to be putting Michigan poets on billboards all around the state. And so the Department of Education has 10 school districts, and I'm hoping that by the end of the year that I can put one billboard in a pedestrian area where there's high foot traffic in every single one of those districts, so that each area of Michigan can not only see a poet, but one that is local to their community, and that they can read an excerpt of their poem off the billboard, and then they can use a QR code to view the whole poem and learn more about other poets. Part of the reason why I want to do this is because I just really want to decenter myself. I think we haven't had a poet laureate in 60 years, but Michigan has such great poets that we really could just need to have as much public celebration of the poets that we have, because we do amazing things here in Michigan. So yeah.
Yeah, and I just got an image because I'm thinking of the billboards. Hopefully they're still there, because I haven't been back to Detroit in 6 years. But billboards in the neighborhoods where I grew up. I grew up Livernois and Davison. There was one by the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Then my parents, before they both passed, they last lived in the Dexter Joy Road area. There were a bunch there. So I'm just imagining this is going to be an amazing project.
So I think that's the other, so you asked about what does it mean to be, what is the the joys of like, what does it mean to be a Detroiter in Michigan?
Yeah.
I think, some people ask me that, but I don't think your question is as weighted as some people. Like the difference, someone asked me one time, well, I mean, you write about a lot about Detroit. Like, what does that mean for like Michigan? And I think, one of the things that I think people should keep in mind is that I am one poet on what we hope will be a long list of poets. And so I definitely write from a Detroit perspective, but I think that sometimes people forget that Detroit is a part of Michigan, and that Michigan, has so many, cultures, right? So what will it look like when someone from the UP or someone from Saginaw or someone from, Traverse City is the poet laureate? Like they will be representative of Michigan as well. As a Detroiter, I am a Michigan writer and I write from a Michigan perspective. And so what's been nice though is that like when I was with those 70 students, I think they were like just like, oh my God, like there's this poet who is a dynamic person and you're from our state. And I want to go to Detroit and learn more about where you were from. Like it became a moment where it's even a cultural exchange. And then more so for me, like I hadn't even been up to the UP until last year when I went on my tour. And so it's been just so beautiful to get to know my state. It's not a prerequisite to know the state, like know the state. So we're learning about each other mutually. I'm learning about Michiganders as much as they're learning about me. So it's been really, really great. I 100% recommend any poet who wants to do it. But it is a lot. I've been on tour for a year now. Yeah. Yeah. It's probably one of the rare moments so that people understand poet laureates are all over the country. There are only, before I was appointed, Michigan was only one of 4 states that did not have a poet laureate. But that's not to mention the many cities and museums and just jurisdictions. There's a poet laureate of the UP, for example, of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And there's our state capital, Lansing, has a poet laureate, as does Flint and Grand Rapids. And I've met them and we've done events together, which has been very nice. But keeping that in mind, the poet laureate position of any jurisdiction has been traditionally underfunded. It is oftentimes so underfunded that mostly the only people that can do it are folks that have time to do it. And so Michigan has really invested in this program. It's not, I don't have an honorarium that means that I only do the poet laureate work. Being on tour means that I'm going to other stops to help supplement the funding from the honorarium that I received. But Michigan did very well compared to other places. I was able to speak to other poet laureates and learn that Michigan is doing a lot better than some places. But it's still not enough to live off of. It's not enough to completely live off of. I do have to hustle to make sure that all the bills are paid.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I look forward to the last part of my responsibility is helping to select the next poet laureate of Michigan.
Nice. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning too about the the financial status of it, because I have conversations, because I live in Connecticut, but my work is in Western Mass. Like the borders, as you know,
Mhm,
they're very close.
mhm,
And I'm close with past poets laureate or current. And that was one of the things that we talked about in terms of and I eventually want to do a larger conversation around this where like there's, I'm not going to mention which places because I don't want to out folks, but like some cities and towns in New England in particular of their poets laureate ask a lot out of them, especially with a lot of public outreach and public programming, but
mhm.
there's not a lot of financial support. So
No.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'm also glad too that Michigan's program, it sounds a lot different than many of the ones that I'm familiar with out here in New England. It's more about I love that Michigan is more about making a connection with folks of all ages, especially like school, like students and things like that, as
Mhm,
opposed to it being like poetry being very insular. It's within,
mhm,
at least out here,
mhm,
some of the poets laureate. It's the work still lives within the literary community as opposed to reaching out. So I love that the Michigan program gives a little bit more breadth, but also too for folks. And I have to keep reminding folks, Michigan is a creative state. I have to keep reminding folks, the people not only that come out of Michigan, but like, for example, our alma mater, University of Michigan, has one of the top creative writing graduate
mhm.
programs.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
right. So I'm
Mhm,
like, so to hear, and affirm that Michigan has like a very particular, writers community, poets community as well, is so vital.
mhm.
And thank you for including that in the
Yeah.
question. And then lastly, I wanted to say too, as a Detroiter and Michigander that has been removed, I haven't lived in Michigan since 2007. Um, I love that whenever I say I'm from Detroit and I meet, there's a lot of the Detroit diaspora out here in New
Oh,
England
yeah.
because people come out here for graduate school. But I love like when I've had a chance to talk with folks who are from other parts of the state and they get it. It's just so interesting, like how, like actually at a conference yesterday I attended, and there was a woman there from the Metro Detroit area, and we had a chance to talk. And it's people, I love that, Michigan has a very clear identity. Detroit has a very clear identity for a lot of folks, and Detroit is a part of Michigan as identity because I know for the longest time, Detroit
Mhm.
stood it as its own identity, and then Michigan was a weird ancillary, whereas now it's like I'm from Detroit, Michigan, not just from Detroit and not just from Michigan.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
so I think that's the way that we as Detroiters have always had to like push for.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that that's true innately in the way that we think about Michigan, but I am saying I am a Detroiter. Detroit is in Michigan. Therefore, I'm a Michigander, and you don't get to separate them, right? You don't get to say, "Oh yeah, but you're from Detroit." Well, what do you say? How do you say that to like somebody from like Muskegon? Why would you say that to someone that is from Flint? And Flint is more like Detroit than it is to like Marquette,
Yep.
right? So does Flint not get to be a part of Michigan as well? Like, I think what we have to start to do, what we really need to do is to think about just how diverse Michigan actually is. And I've been challenged on it myself. I was in Battle Creek and I was like, oh wow, y'all are doing it out here. I went to a soul food restaurant outside of out on in Western Michigan, best catfish I've had. And I was like, okay, let me change my own notions about what Michigan culture is, right?
Wow. He says, so I'm gonna have to find this place. I'm like, soul food restaurant in Battle Creek.
Well, and then, and that's not even to discuss, like, I'm mentioning soul food, but like, one of the things that like people don't think about is like, when we think about rural culture, we're not thinking about migrant workers, right? And think about how Michigan's landscape has been changed by migrant workers. In almost every small town where there is a large agrarian culture, in that town, in their main town, a lot of times there's a Mexican restaurant that is fire
Yep.
because somebody's mama and baba decided they not moving around no more. They gonna set up shop right here and they're serving the community with their delicious food. So like those are things that people like typically don't think of, but what does it mean to be, if we're an agrarian culture, we are also a Mexican culture. Like we are also, we might be from the Motor City, but we are also, like Flint had a migration as well. Like we're we're 2 3 generations removed from the South as well. Like there's so many things that are part of Michigan culture that we forget, because I think that oftentimes when we say the Midwest, we are saying white, and that just isn't true. That's not true. But even if it is, even within that white culture, there's diversity. Even within our Black culture, there is diversity. So I think one of the things that I have learned is that I'm challenging my own notions of what Michigan is as well.
I can't wait to go back. And you making me think back to, 'cause I did one of my grad degrees at Wayne State, and I lived near campus. There was this amazing Lebanese restaurant right next door to my apartment building. I hope it's still there on West Palmer Street. And I'm just like, I miss that place, and I just miss. And people don't realize, because New England is white. And whenever I tell people about like where I grew up and just the diversity, within Michigan, people are like, oh, like people like in New England, people just can't fathom that people of difference live to and like create community together. I miss home.
And let me explode people who are not accustomed to Michigan, and tell you one thing about Michiganders, especially Southeastern Michigan. We are very picky about our Middle Eastern food.
Yeah.
I don't think people understand that you don't have to be Arab to be picky about your Middle Eastern food, because in Michigan, in Southeastern Michigan, we have the largest population of Arab folk outside of the Arabic world, which means that we get all kinds of Middle Eastern food in Michigan. And there's such a competition that it's really hard to not have good Middle Eastern food when you go somewhere. So what's so bad about it is like, take a Southeastern Michigan person out of Southeastern Michigan and take them to go get falafel anywhere, and we will be mad at what has happened. Because we got a way in which we love, but people don't think Middle Eastern food when they think Michigan. And that's something those are other things that we will have to kind of grapple with in like what we have determined, and also the people that we have ignored as a result of thinking of such a narrow understanding of what our culture is.
Yes, thank you for that. Because like I miss that diversity. Because like here now there's Middle Eastern restaurants popping up, at least in Western Mass, and like I'll get falafel or I'll get the fattoush salad, and I'm just like, you did this for New England, right? It's about as bland as toothpaste. I'm like, I can't. I'm like, what is that?
I took a poet, a dear friend of mine, Ross Gay, through a drive-through in Detroit at this place called Cedarland, and he bit into his falafel sandwich and said, "You got this out of a drive-through?"
Yes.
Back to poetry. I know we talking food, y'all. I'm sorry, but I do just to reiterate, this is a part of how Michigan, the stereotype of Michigan and what the real Michigan is something that I've been contemplating a lot during this experience. What does it mean that I'm as much a representative as Michigan as I am Detroit? And so, yeah, I'm y'all's. They don't get to like ignore me. I'm theirs,
Yes, just to hear a y'all, thank you. Because whenever I say it here in New England, people are like, where are you from? And I'm like I literally have to even tell my students, I'm like, because here there's like a huge, Caribbean diaspora within this region. And when I say y'all, and they're like, are you from the South? No, okay. Let me explain to you how the Great Migration worked with regards to the Midwest, and then compare it to, the immigration, like populations here in the Northeast. And they're like, oh, okay, we get it now. So just to hear a y'all was just so affirming right now. Yes. And this takes me to the next question. You've had opportunities to develop your writing in communities of other Black authors like Cave Canem and the Detroit poetry scene. How have these spaces contributed to your work as a writer? And why do you think it is important for writers to find and participate in these types of spaces? And I also would love for you, and because I'm an academic, my questions are long. I'm more than happy to repeat things. I also love for you to talk about your work with Detroit Lit.
Oh, okay. So the work of a writer is the result of multiple communities investing in you. It's as simple as that. It doesn't matter if you are cognizant of it or not, but if you go to an MFA, that is a result of courageous writers deciding that within the academic field, in their academic institution, it is a righteous work to build an institution that will nurture the next writers. And one has to acknowledge that, right? So I've been the benefactor of so many different groups of people who have had the audacity to create space where for writers who did not have spaces to work. And I find myself also dedicating my energy and time to doing that kind of institution building as well. So Cave Canem, which was started by Toy Derricott and Cornelius Eady. Toy Derricott from Hamtramck, another Michigan writer. They had this dream to develop a space for Black poets. And that space is really sacred to me. I started my relationship with Cave Canem when I attended the retreat in 2018. And it's a really just powerful, dynamic retreat. And when they say Black writers, it is in the broadest definition. All you have to be is a Black writer. I met British writers, Caribbean writers, queer writers, cowboy writers, middle school teacher writers, and like fully academic, right? Like all kinds of writers. And so it was not just like slam. It wasn't slam. There were slammers there were page writers there. All you had to be was a writer who identified as Black. And so the thing that's so remarkable about that space is that by acknowledging that vastness in the Black identity, we all, under that umbrella, found the strength in that. And one of the things that they do is for their faculty, these are very accomplished writers. I mean, I was working under Natasha Trethewey and Toy Derricott, and I was in a room with Cornelius Eady and Carl Phillips, like just incredible writers. So that alone, that kind of, not just, and I don't want to make it like that, because for me, the access, a lot of people get really like fascinated by and really like driven to be in a space where you get access to writers that are so accomplished. But at the same time, those writers have had their own, rites of passage and ushering into this field. So they're there with a kind of giving nature of helping you as a writer achieve a goal, but also just like being in a space that it's an intensive, we write a poem a day. By the end of that day, that poem is also a workshop. So it changed the way that I thought about that. And that network is so strong that once you are a part of it, it keeps giving you opportunities. So the people that I met in that network are dear friends of mine. Like whenever they walk in a room, if they call me when they're in Detroit, they have me. It's simple as that, right? And I think that some people call us a bit of a mafia, but I don't care. Like it has changed the landscape of writing in American letters. That said, when I say that like people have invested in me in that way, without their work, I don't become who I am. I have now started to see, I had a mentor, Vivi Francis, who she was in Detroit and decided to, along with another writer, Christina Archer, start this thing called Right Word Right Now, which no longer exists now. But it was a workshop that monthly, she invited multiple writers who were at like just starting their writing careers, like really didn't know what we were doing at all in terms of trying to publish. And she took us in like once a month, invited us to her house and was like, this is how you work on a lyric poem. This is how you try to get published. Here's an institution that you should be looking out for. These are writers you need to be reading. And that kind of direct mentorship led to a group of writers really becoming established. And now you have the National Book Award finalist and Whiting Award winner, Tommy Blount. You have Jamal May. You have Erica Foreman. And, we all had different relationships with the workshop. Some of us got kicked out for the workshop, but some of us just were like collectively friends and then kept on working together. So like Francine Harris was at one point working with us. Dee Matthews was also working with us. So a lot of some people calling the Detroit School came out of this selfless work of two writers deciding that there wasn't enough outlets for Detroit writers to learn about how to professionalize themselves. Keeping that in mind, now Detroit Lit, we're preparing for our third year. Well, we've been doing work for a long time, but COVID put a pause in our work. But in the summer, we'll be doing our first Writers Institute, where we're going to be doing some professional development. We'll be doing some courses on how to build your CV, how to write a CV, how to write a pitch for a fiction, a piece of fiction. There'll be a panel discussion so that people can learn the differences between like your editor, your publicist, your booking manager, things like that. And Detroit Lit is really built around trying to give access to people to understand the field once you've already written the work. So I know there's a lot of desire to do creative writing workshops, but I think that a lot of people, once they write the work in Detroit, they have no idea what to do with it. They don't know where to publish it. And so we really want to build a space where we want to be a place where people can come to us and get some like real like resources on what to do with
and thank you for doing that, because actually at the conference I attended yesterday was the Right Angles conference, which is out of Straw Dog Writers Guild, which is based in Western Mass. And somebody actually asked me in terms a question that they didn't realize was going to turn into me talking about the business of writing. And it was a question about my spoken word album. And my dogs are making a premiere right now. I was wondering when they were going to chime in, because they typically chime in by now. And somebody was asking me about, like, what was the process of doing the album? And I said, producing the album was a lot of fun. Selling it and all of that sucked. It sucked because there was just so much I didn't know. And I'm like, writing exists in two spaces. There's the creative process, but then there's also the business of writing. And I love that Detroit Lit is finding a moment to talk about the business of writing, because I feel like there's so many creatives out there who have large bodies of work, but they just aren't clear about how to connect it with audiences and then also to have it as an income stream. So I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, we're still, Detroit Lit is specifically geared towards writers of color in Detroit, partially because we have such a large population of writers of color. And I do find those writers to be the ones that tend to be struggling more with not being able to enter into what is a pretty dense career. And a lot of it is just because the institutions aren't in Detroit, right? And so there are institutions in Michigan, but they're just not as many as you see in some other metropolitan cities. And so I really wanted to put the writers of color at the forefront of these services. If, I feel like we've done enough work within the writers of color community, then maybe we'll expand, but it's really for writers of color because they tend to be the ones that most don't know how to move from being the creative to being on the administrative side of their careers.
As a Black poet, why is it important to you to write within this particular genre? And how do you wish for your work to contribute to the literary canon?
I was thinking about that question. When you say genre, are you talking about poetry in particular, or are you or is there anything like, or are you just thinking in general writing?
In general, writing. That's a great question, and thank you for the great follow question. Writing in general.
So I think I feel oftentimes, because I came from a Black nationalist family, I grew up kind of thinking that Black writing looked a specific way, and that my Blackness had to be at the forefront of everything that I was writing. And for me, it became to a point where it didn't feel natural, and partly because what I was doing was I was being imitative of writers from the 60s and 70s and not really actually being reflective of what was happening in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2020s now, right? And so one of the philosophies that I've come to is that I am a writer, I am Black. Anything that I write is Black writing. Period. Now, I'm not gonna try to assume that when I write a story that doesn't have any Black characters in it, that I can consider it a story about Black life. No. But I do think that because Blackness, and I go back to this, is that our identities are vast and they are complex, and we should never feel isolated from the Black community because we didn't grow up in a Black community, or because we didn't grow up at the right time period, or because we had an experience that doesn't necessarily meet that of our peers that are directly connected to us, right? And I think it also, if we as a community start to understand that our Blackness, our identity is what makes us Black, doesn't matter what that identity is, the fact that we are claiming our Blackness and whatever else that is, that whatever we are doing is Black, then we will start to understand how stereotypes don't really hold up, right? So there's a really great quote where it says, like, every time I meet someone, I forget where I'd heard it from, but every time I meet someone and somebody says, I've never met a Black person like you, the question is, why would you say that, like, I'm so different than everybody, than your preconceived notions of Blackness, versus saying that your presence is something that is Black and therefore means that I need to broaden my idea of Blackness, as opposed to seeing me as an exception to what is Blackness. Understand that I am inclusive of anything that you should conceive of as Black, right? and actually challenge Black people to think that way too, because oftentimes I'm, looked at in the kind of side, you different. You definitely different. And I'm not going to assume that, like, I don't have a different upbringing than most African Americans where I'm from. But I find a lot of commonality with a lot of Black writers. I don't find myself to be that odd or strange. And so for me, I'm like, it's not about me not understanding where my writing is Black, but other people conceiving me as not an exception to the rule, but actually representative of what, of what Blackness can do, I don't know if I answered your question completely, but that's
no. And I'm glad that you talked about the expansiveness of Blackness too. I that's and I think that's really important in terms of the canon. And this is why I say with Black writers read, my goal is to, and I know the African diaspora is extremely expansive, And I remember I was challenged when Black Writers Read first came out. I had an Afro Latine writer was like, this isn't a space for me because they assumed, you know, a lot of African American writers because of my identity. And I was like, okay, no, like I understand like how, you know, those cruise ships that came during the Middle Passage, how they operated and how they worked, where, you know, many of our, you know, ancestors, and I say cruise ship in a very dangerous way, but um a lot of our ancestors went, you know, south of the equator. I understand that. And so that's why I'm like, I like my goal is to try to have a very expansive beyond just Black writers in the US because
Mm-hmm.
I understand, and especially, and even too, like even like writers from Detroit, like you and I are very different, even just as folks. So
Mm-hmm.
this is
Right.
why, yeah, this is why Black Writers Read is what it is, because I'm like, yeah, I know it's a huge task to be like, you know, Black is, you know, so many different things. So thank you for
Mm-hmm.
that particular response. Yeah. And then lastly, what is next for you, and how can the Black Writers Read community support you in this journey?
Oh, so don't forget me. That would be the best way to
Yes.
not support me. Please do not forget me. I am writing. I am doing my thing. As I said before, I'm working on a collection right now. I will be serving as poet laureate until December. What is the work, or like what will be my earning position? I don't know yet. I'm still out here looking for something that will start preferably in January, but I'm also like not necessarily preferably in January. I should say, like, you know, I'm out here. I've got a couple of things out there that I've been, you know, working on in terms of projects and stuff, but I feel very confident that like after December there'll be something else, you know. But for me right now, the most important is getting this collection of poems together. I said that I was writing about the 90s and what it meant to be like a woman growing up in the 90s, but part of that is also grounded in writing these poems about the incident of Malice Green. It was
Oh.
so you and I are the same age. Well, one of the things that was happening is that I would mention Malice Green in spaces, and I think it was partly because I was witnessing a artist do a new mural tribute to him, and amongst other people that had lost their lives to police violence. And I realized that people about 10 years younger than us do not know his story. And so I just did a brief kind of research because I wanted to read more about it. We were young when it happened, and I wanted to know exactly how things unfolded. And when I looked, I realized that there, in the main branch of the library, the only book that I could find was a book that was written by one of the police officers who killed him. And I found that to be a great disservice to a time that was so key for anyone who was an adolescent up to an adult during the 90s who had experienced that, right? And so while I don't think that I can right the wrong of how history is remembering him right now, I think it's worth it to continue to write these poems, to continue to investigate what was happening in Detroit at that time. And so that's where my work is right now. I'm hoping that I can get that book finished fairly soon, so that we can get it published. But
Oh.
let's knock on wood. Who knows? We might talk in 6 months and I might be like, oh yeah, I was writing those poems and I decided I'm just doing something completely different. So that's how poetry works. That's how writing works. Sometimes you got a whole book idea that turns into something else once you start really writing it out. So I've got poems about coming of age. Most of the poems are located between 2010. I'm sorry, between 1990 and 2000 or 1999, because that is actually right between the time that I was 10 and 20. And so I'm really excited about a lot of that work.
Yep, I think we are the exact same age.
Yep. Yep.
Because when you
Yeah.
said Malice Green, I was
hmm
taken back, not to, keep the interview going, but I was taken back to watching the trial and like
Oh
the
yeah.
reading of the verdict on Channel 4 and
Yeah.
home dude's head hitting hitting the table. I like, and then also
Right.
passing, the mural, like, wow, yep.
And so
Very, yeah,
for some, for us, that name is simultaneous with Rodney King, but
yep,
people don't remember Malice the way that, like, Rodney King is because of the riots, because of this national thing. And for us, I think for people in Detroit, we thought it was such a huge case because we were experiencing it every day. But the rest of the world, I mean, I don't even think he was even a headline for most of the rest of the world. And so, right, that feeling of knowing that, right? And for us, it was something that was an experience that was so real. So, the book is not about Malice Green, but there are a lot of questions that his life brings up for me while I'm, thinking about my own coming of age story. So, yeah.
yeah. And I'm thinking about like my own and the things that were happening in Detroit at the time. Like I remember when, well, we were much younger, like when Hudson's closed and was torn down, and
hmm
then the buildings that were placed in its place, which now Woodward Avenue looks and feels so different than when we were younger. I still haven't been back, even with the building of the Little Caesars Arena. And also, I remember when I went back for the first time and saw that train on Woodward, and I was like, interesting. And just other like formative moments. Like I even remember when what is the name of that park downtown by I think the CompuWare building. I even remember when that Campus Martius. I remember when that was built, and just like how that really like really fed into my identity, and also to belong, like, and how it fed into like my belonging, and then also to like even now, because I recently reconnected with a bunch of people I went to high school with, even now, like here when I first heard about like my high school being torn down. And so it's just so interesting, like just the many formative experiences and that were happening there. And especially Malice Green was a big one for me. I remember,
hmm
oh my God, I
Yeah.
remember that like it was yesterday.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. So
Yeah.
that is, one of the things that I am grappling with in the work. I write a lot slower than these two books came out, my first two books. So and then I guess like the only other way I would say supporting, get the books, peruse them,
Mhm.
support local bookstores who support local writers.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh, because I recently ordered American Family, and I'm waiting for that to come in. But I'm so grateful that you were on today, Nandi. This was such an
Thanks
amazing conversation.
Thanks for having me. This is great. I haven't done a virtual event in maybe like a year, so this is really cool.
Yes. So thank you so much for being on. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap us up for the afternoon. So thank you so much for joining us for episode 12 of season 4 of Black Writers Read. We'll be back on April 14th with our next National Poetry Month guest. Find us online at blackwritersread.com. Support Black Writers Read by subscribing to my YouTube channel or to the audio podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Also, please feel free to drop a review of Black Writers Read from the platform that you get your podcast. By supporting us as a subscriber or a reviewer, you're growing our community, which can lead to future sponsorships and longer term financial sustainability of the platform. So, thank you all for spending your afternoon with us, and more importantly, for ensuring that Black authors continue to matter. Have a great week.